Implicit attitudes are very interesting creatures. They sit in our minds, their preferences, their likes and dislikes, just like any attitude is. But the word implicit is there to remind us that attitudes can exist in a form that is not available to conscious awareness, that even if I'm aware of it, I may not be able to control it. Just like I can't put my foot on the pedal fast enough to stop a car under certain conditions, likewise, certain attitudes are just going to run off. Social psychologists came to implicit attitudes in part because the kinds of things social psychologists want to study, people aren't willing to reveal. We want to know what's going on in people's minds and in their behavior. The more we learn about the human mind, the more we know that what appears to us to come consciously to our minds is a thin sliver of much of the working of the human brain and the mind. But it's the only part we know, because it's the only part we can reach. So we think that everything in our heads is conscious, because that's the part that we are in close touch with. So one of the reasons implicit attitudes are important is because we think that they affect many things that we do. They affect whether we make eye contact with people, whether we smile at them, how close we pull a chair up, how we grade them, whether we hire them or not. All of this stuff without necessarily knowing that we have an attitude, and interestingly, sometimes in opposition to what we might think is our attitude. So I might say to you, you know, I believe that when we have a job opening, that male and female candidates are going to be, in my mind, equally likely to get this job. Okay? I say it with fullest confidence and with complete sincerity. But if you look at my track record, that's not what my preferences show. So in 1998, two of my colleagues, Tony Greenwald at the University of Washington and Brian Nosek at Virginia, we gave ourselves a month to build a website that would house some of these tests. We did it for a couple of different reasons. We did it because we thought it would be nice to take the work that we were doing in our laboratories and make it available to the general public so they could see that this is the stuff that their dollars are funding. But the second reason that I certainly did it is because I taught at a school with a very small subject sample. And so it would take me months to get a study done. And I thought, well, maybe if we go to the web, we'll get 100 people in a month or something like that. We had no idea that these tests would be so popular. In the first month, we had 40,000 completed tests. And basically, the IATs allow people to first state what their conscious attitude is towards whatever the object is. Do you like Pepsi or Coke? Do you like black or white? Do you like male or female? Whatever might be the question. And then they take a test that actually measures how rapidly they can associate that concept with good and bad. Sometimes the two are in the same direction and nobody's surprised. I say I like Coke and I actually show a preference for Coke over Pepsi. But here I say I like both black and white equally and I'm showing a strong white preference. So when you have that kind of experience, makes you at least sit and think. It makes you, first of all, resist the result of the test. So we've been very lucky. The test has rubbed so many people the wrong way that they generate all kinds of reasons why the test must not be right. And in doing so, they've given us lots of hypotheses that we then go off and test to see if they're right or not. And what we find is that members of majority groups show huge amounts of preference for their own group. 80% of whites show preference for white. But only 50% of African Americans show such a preference. So that raises the question, why is it that if everybody is supposed to like their own group, why do some groups not show that kind of result? So we've learned lots of very interesting things from the web data, and these days it has become a source of data analysis as well, and we derive lots of new ideas and hypotheses from the data that come through the website. On the IAT and its use in what we'll call selection contexts, a context in which you're actually administering the test to a person to make a decision about whether to hire that person or not, I take a very clear and very firm position that it should not be used in that context. Our implicit attitudes are not things that we're even aware of. And the law has made a very clear distinction between behaviors that we perform that are within our control, for which we ought to be held responsible, versus those that might operate at some other level of consciousness that are not within conscious control, that we are not and should not be held responsible in exactly the same way for. I don't believe that its use lies in administering to decide whether a police officer can get a job, whether somebody is patriotic enough to serve in the army. Those would be wrong uses of it, in part because the test isn't valid enough to make a decision like that. But secondly, those implicit attitudes, we would hope, are not always the things on which people will behave or act. Let's say I have to serve on a jury, and I have this really negative, let's say anti-black attitude, but implicitly. But I'm the kind of person who wishes to put that aside and do something about it. Okay? That's for me to decide what I want to do about, and that's what I ought to be held accountable for, not necessarily the implicit attitudes. Many students of mine have shown that I was wrong by going off and doing studies to show that implicit attitudes are quite malleable. They're very sensitive to input. If we end up teaching kids that A is good and B is bad, and they learn that, and then a few days later we flip that around and we say, oops, no, it's actually A that's bad and B that's good, their minds are going to just wrap around that and learn. But not just with kids. This is true even of adults. If our environment signal to us something new that is not like all the stuff we've learned over the years, it turns out that the adaptive minds that we have will change. This is very good news because it suggests that whatever it is that we may have learned that we don't particularly like, we can unlearn, we can relearn. As we make decisions, most of us aren't even aware of the minuscule levels at which bias might creep into a decision. So one way to change this, of course, is to become aware, to read the work, to understand at what moments in the decision-making path can our preferences and our attitudes and our beliefs and likes and dislikes affect and shape the choices we're making without us being aware. One of the things I realized after having taken my own tests was a bias against the elderly that I apparently carry around in my mind that I didn't know about. Compared to the young, the elderly don't shine in my mind. And so one of the things I've noticed now is that my behavior to elderly people is not negative, it's just that I avoid them. So when I'm crossing the street, I just prefer not to look in their direction. And now that I know that, I've actually done a lot to change it. You'll be surprised. Try smiling at an elderly person the next time and you'll see how shocked they'll look at you because their worlds are not worlds in which people smile at them very much. Social psychologists are in the business of showing that prejudices exist, showing what they might predict, showing the ways in which they may cause harm. But social psychologists are not in the job of telling people that they must change. That's more or less, I would say, the job of each individual person. So there are lots of techniques that social psychologists can suggest as ways in which biases can be corrected, while always keeping in mind that as scientists, all they can do is point the path, but never impose it.